Number three, Canada has seen its own movements. The colonial troops of the RCMP, or Royal Canadian Mounted Police, have again invaded the Wet'suwet'en yintah at the order of colonial courts. Blockades and marches sprang up in response with solidarity actions across the globe. Militant port and rail blockades, or the threat of blockades, have been particularly effective in British Columbia and on indigenous lands in Kahnawake, Listuguj, Tyendinaga, Six Nations, and elsewhere, which shut down industrial and commercial transportation. Now, First Nations are struggling to maintain their jurisdiction, not just in the face of oil company mercenaries and man camps, but opportunistic settlers seeking isolated areas free from disease. Discuss.
I was looking into some of historical pieces around the struggle of Indigenous people here in Canada. And there's some videotapes on YouTube around the white papers that when Pierre Trudeau was working with Indigenous, I just felt so much shame for not knowing all that history. It gave me a totally different perspective. The dialogue that the Indigenous communities brought to the table was so respectful. There was so much clarity. I talked about autonomy and self-determination with giving language. We want to live in harmony, and we're okay with a little bit of land that you've given us. Let's work out the details so that we can live in peace and we can live with dignity in spite of everything that had happened, oppression on Indigenous community. There was still a desire to be willing to work it out. The attitude from the government was dismissive and so offensive. Government continues to oppress. I find it very shameful.
The center of all Indigenous liberation movements is a struggle for land. It's a struggle for sovereignty and autonomy. And unfortunately, existing in a colonial capitalist world, that land is very much viewed as an extractive resource or something that could be profited from. It's the nature of capitalism, and Indigenous peoples understand that, and they have a much different relationship to land. It's always been that. It's always been centered around land. And there's always been this sort of expectation of Indigenous peoples, is this expectation for them to be polite or to be respectful, to not be emotional or whatever in the face of the oppressor. The oppressor tries to put on this facade. I have emotional intelligence. Look at me. It's like this theater of I am more intelligent, or like there's a dynamic that's like forced upon especially Indigenous peoples, expecting them to be polite people in their resistance.
I'm just wondering if we can move to the next point.
Many of these struggles have been overshadowed by the global political, economic, and health crisis caused by the novel coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic. The United Nations has called the quote, the most challenging crisis since World War II, unquote. In Canada, all levels of government have imposed social distancing and partial lockdowns as the primary public health measure in response to the pandemic. These measures are necessary to limit the spread of the disease, but have caused mass unemployment, with millions of Canadians applying for some form of federal unemployment help since March. I mean, there was a lot happening. 2020 has already been very eventful. All the blockades and war in Iran seems like a long time ago. This sort of radical change, sort of unprecedented crisis that we're experiencing right now. I don't know if folks want to add to that. More like a transitioning section.